On the 23rd of June 1944, as dawn broke over the Normandy beaches, British intelligence officers received word that would send ripples through Allied command. Forward reconnaissance units had discovered something extraordinary abandoned in a hedgerow near Villers-Bocage, a German Panther Ausführung G tank, nearly intact, its crew having fled during the chaotic night retreat. Within hours, the massive steel beast was being winched onto a heavy transport trailer, destined for the School of Tank Technology in Bovington, Dorset, where Britain's finest military engineers waited with barely contained anticipation. The Panther had earned a fearsome reputation across every theater where it appeared. British tank crews returning from Operation Overlord spoke in hushed, respectful tones about the German machine's devastating 75mm gun and its sloped armor that seemed to deflect British shells like raindrops. Intelligence reports from the Eastern Front painted an equally troubling picture. Soviet T-34 tanks, previously considered formidable, were being systematically destroyed by Panthers operating at ranges where return fire proved ineffective. The question that haunted British military planners was simple yet urgent. How could they counter this technological marvel? Major Edmund Keyes stood in the reception bay at Bovington as the captured Panther arrived on the 1st of July. An Oxford-educated mechanical engineer who had traded his academic robes for military khaki in 1939, Keyes had spent the past 3 years analyzing enemy armor for the War Office. He had examined destroyed Panzer IIIs and IVs, studied the heavy Tiger I with its formidable armor, but nothing had prepared him for the Panther. At 45 tons, the vehicle was a marriage of sophisticated engineering and brutal firepower. Its long-barreled gun projected forward like an accusatory finger, while the sloped frontal armor, a design clearly influenced by Soviet innovations, presented angles calculated to maximize protection while minimizing weight. "Gentlemen," Keyes addressed his assembled team of 12 engineers and technicians, "we have approximately 6 weeks to completely understand this machine. The Ministry expects a comprehensive technical evaluation, and High Command wants to know its vulnerabilities." He paused, running his hand along the tank's dusty flank. "More specifically, they want to know if our rumors about reliability issues hold any truth." Those rumors had been circulating since late 1943. According to a report published in the Times of London that spring, citing anonymous sources within military intelligence, German Panthers were experiencing catastrophic mechanical failures at an alarming rate. British agents operating in occupied France had reported seeing Panthers abandoned along roadsides, some still smoldering from internal fires. Captured German maintenance logs suggested that Panther battalions were lucky to have 50% operational readiness on any given day. If these reports were accurate, the fearsome predator might have a fatal flaw hidden beneath its impressive exterior. Captain Thomas Whitmore, Keyes' second-in-command and a brilliant automotive engineer from Coventry, circled the Panther with a clipboard, making preliminary notes. "Sir, the transmission housing shows unusual discoloration patterns," he observed, pointing to brown staining near the rear engine deck. "Heat damage, possibly from inadequate cooling." Keyes nodded thoughtfully. The evaluation was beginning, and within weeks, they would discover just how prophetic Whitmore's initial observation would prove to be. By the 8th of July, 1944, Keyes' team had systematically photographed, measured, and cataloged every external feature of the captured Panther. Now came the meticulous task of disassembly, a process that would reveal both the genius and the fatal compromises embedded in German tank design philosophy. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the workshop's high windows, 6 engineers began removing the engine deck plates, exposing the Panther's 12-cylinder Maybach HL 230 petrol engine. "Bloody hell," muttered Sergeant Robert McTavish, a Scottish mechanic who had spent 15 years maintaining civilian vehicles before the war transformed him into a military technical specialist. "Look at how they've packaged everything." The engine compartment was a masterwork of spatial efficiency, with components nested together with minimal clearance. The Maybach engine, delivering approximately 700 horsepower, was coupled to a complex transmission system that Keyes recognized immediately as potentially revolutionary and potentially catastrophic. The Panther employed what German engineers called the AK-7200 gearbox, manufactured by ZF Friedrichshafen. It was a sophisticated double-radius design that offered 7 forward gears and 1 reverse gear, theoretically providing excellent tactical flexibility. However, as Captain Whitmore carefully extracted the transmission for bench examination, the first warning signs became apparent. "Sir, the gear teeth show unusual wear patterns," he reported, adjusting his spectacles to peer closely at the mechanisms. "This isn't consistent with normal operational stress. It appears the gears were inadequately hardened during manufacture." Keyes understood the implication immediately. Germany's strategic situation had grown increasingly desperate throughout 1943 and into 44. Allied bombing campaigns had targeted industrial facilities across the Ruhr Valley and other manufacturing centers. Intelligence reports suggested that German factories were cutting corners, rushing production to meet impossible quotas demanded by Berlin. The consequence was sitting before them: a technologically advanced transmission built with substandard materials and insufficient quality control. Over the following week, the team's investigation revealed a cascade of design compromises. The Panther's final drive units, the crucial components that translated engine power into track movement, were particularly concerning. Each final drive was rated for approximately 150 kilometers of operation before requiring complete rebuild. By comparison, British Churchill and American Sherman tanks could reliably operate for over 1,000 kilometers between major drivetrain services. "They've optimized for combat performance over operational longevity," Keyes wrote in his preliminary report to the War Office. "The Panther is a sprinter, not a marathon runner." Lieutenant David Harrison, a Cambridge-trained physicist serving as the team's thermal dynamics specialist, had been investigating the cooling system. On the 15th of July, he presented findings that would prove central to understanding the Panther's vulnerability. "Major, the engine cooling arrangement is fundamentally inadequate," Harrison explained, pointing to detailed drawings he had prepared. "The radiators are positioned here and here," he indicated locations on the diagram. "But the airflow path is compromised by the transmission positioning. Under sustained operation, particularly in warm conditions, the engine compartment temperatures exceed safe operational parameters." According to information later corroborated by technical intelligence documents captured in 1945 and referenced in subsequent historical analyses published by the Tank Museum, the Panther's engine bay could reach temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Celsius during extended operations. Fuel lines, many constructed from synthetic rubber compounds that had replaced increasingly scarce natural rubber in German manufacturing, would degrade rapidly under such thermal stress. Oil seals would fail, and leaked fluids, pooling on superheated metal surfaces, would ignite. "We need to test this theory," Keyes announced to his assembled team. "Prepare the Panther for operational trials. Let's see if we can replicate the failures that German crews have reportedly experienced." What none of them could have anticipated was just how quickly and dramatically their hypothesis would be confirmed. The morning of the 22nd of July, 1944, arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that characterizes English summers. Major Keyes stood beside the first captured Panther, now fully reassembled and mechanically restored to operational condition, on the testing grounds at Bovington. The massive tank had been repainted with British roundel markings to prevent friendly fire incidents during field trials, though its distinctive silhouette remained unmistakably German. A skeleton crew of 3 British tankers, volunteers selected for their mechanical sympathy and quick reaction capabilities, had been briefed on emergency procedures. Sergeant James Fletcher would serve as driver, positioned in the hull's front left, peering through a periscope at the undulating Dorset countryside. Corporal William Hayes occupied the radio operator's position, though his primary responsibility today was monitoring internal temperatures using hastily installed thermometers. Lieutenant Peter Ashford, an experienced tank commander who had survived the North African campaign, would direct operations from the turret. "Remember," Keyes addressed the crew through the open commander's hatch, "this is not a combat exercise. We want sustained running time at moderate speeds, circle the northern perimeter track, maintain approximately 20 kilometers per hour, and report any anomalies immediately." He paused, making eye contact with each crew member. At the first sign of smoke, fire, or unusual temperature readings, shut down and evacuate. "Understood?" "Understood, sir," Ashford replied crisply, adjusting his leather tanker's helmet. The Maybach engine roared to life with a deep, powerful note that seemed to make the ground tremble. German engineering had certainly achieved impressive power output, Keyes reflected. The sound was markedly different from British engines, more aggressive, more urgent. Fletcher engaged the transmission with practiced smoothness, and the 45-ton machine began rolling forward, its wide tracks crushing grass and light vegetation as it maneuvered toward the designated testing circuit. For the first hour, the trial proceeded uneventfully. The Panther completed circuit after circuit, its powerful engine maintaining consistent speed across varying terrain. Captain Whitmore stood beside Keyes on the observation post, binoculars raised, watching for any visible indication of distress. Temperature readings remain within acceptable parameters, he reported, monitoring radio transmissions from haze inside the tank. But shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning, the situation changed. Hayes's voice crackled over the radio, urgency creeping into his normally calm Scottish accent. Command, we're showing elevated temperatures in the engine compartment. Gauge is reading 95 degrees and climbing. How's the engine performing? Keyes asked into the transmitter. Running smoothly, sir, but the heat is noticeable even here in the hull. Continue for another 15 minutes, then we'll shut down for inspection, Keyes ordered, though his instincts were already signaling caution. 12 minutes later, Lieutenant Ashford's voice exploded from the radio speaker. Smoke! We have smoke in the engine compartment. Shutting down now! The distant Panther came to an abrupt halt, and Keyes could see 3 figures rapidly evacuating through hatches, moving with the desperate urgency of men who understood the threat of fire in an enclosed metal box containing hundreds of liters of petrol and dozens of high-explosive rounds. The observation team raced across the field in a utility vehicle. By the time they arrived, thin gray smoke was seeping from the engine deck grills, and the acrid smell of burning rubber filled the air. The volunteer fire crew, positioned nearby precisely for this contingency, deployed with practiced efficiency, though Keyes waved them back. Let it develop. We need to understand the failure progression. Over the next 10 minutes, the smoke intensified, darkening from gray to black as various synthetic materials in the engine compartment combusted. When flames finally became visible through the deck grills, Keyes nodded to the fire crew, who quickly suppressed the blaze with foam and carbon dioxide extinguishers. The damage, while controlled, was significant. Melted fuel lines, destroyed wiring harnesses, and extensive heat damage to multiple engine components. Gentlemen, Keyes addressed his team as they examined the smoldering wreckage. We have our first confirmed failure. Document everything. By the 30th of July, 1944, the British technical team had obtained 4 additional captured Panther tanks through the aggressive collection efforts of forward intelligence units in France. Each machine told a similar story. German crews had abandoned them following mechanical failures rather than combat damage. Major Keyes stood in the expanded workshop space at Bovington, surveying the 4 new arrivals like a physician examining patients with a mysterious affliction. The second Panther, captured near Caen, showed evidence of previous fire damage that its crew had apparently attempted to repair in the field. Blackened metal and hastily replaced components suggested German maintenance crews were intimately familiar with the overheating problem. Look here. Captain Whitmore indicated a reinforcing plate welded onto the engine compartment. They've tried to implement a field modification, probably to improve heat shielding. It clearly wasn't effective. Lieutenant Harrison had been conducting a comprehensive thermal analysis using the damaged components from the first trial. His findings, presented to the team on the 2nd of August, painted a damning picture of the Panther's design vulnerabilities. The fundamental issue is insufficient cooling capacity relative to heat generation, Harrison explained, pointing to complex calculations on a chalkboard. The Maybach engine, running at operational loads, produces approximately 2.3 megawatts of waste heat. The radiator system, as designed, can dissipate perhaps 1.8 megawatts under ideal conditions, meaning the system is chronically overwhelmed, Keyes concluded. Precisely, sir. Add in heat from the transmission and final drives, factor in restricted airflow due to combat necessity, tanks must be buttoned up under fire, and you have a recipe for thermal runaway. According to wartime intelligence documents that were declassified in subsequent decades and analyzed in historical publications, including the Journal of Military History, German tank designers were well aware of the Panther's cooling deficiencies during its development phase. However, mounting pressure from Adolf Hitler himself to rush the Panther into production following the shocking appearance of Soviet T-34 tanks on the Eastern Front had resulted in fielding the vehicle before critical issues could be resolved. The disastrous debut of Panther battalions during Operation Citadel in July 1943, where mechanical failures claimed more Panthers than Soviet gunfire, had demonstrated the consequences of this rushed development. The second operational trial commenced on the 5th of August, using one of the newly acquired Panthers that appeared to be in the best mechanical condition. Keyes had implemented modified testing protocols, including mandatory temperature monitoring at 5-minute intervals and a lower sustained speed of 15 kilometers per hour. Despite these precautions, the result proved depressingly familiar. After 87 minutes of operation, smoke began emerging from the engine compartment. This time, the fire developed more rapidly, suggesting that the particular combination of degraded seals and accumulated oil residue in this specific vehicle created especially favorable conditions for combustion. The crew evacuated safely, but flames consumed the engine compartment before fire crews could respond effectively. The Panther's ammunition did not cook off, a small mercy that prevented catastrophic explosion. But the vehicle was thoroughly gutted. 2 Panthers, 2 engine fires, Sergeant McTavish observed grimly as they surveyed the blackened hulk. "I'm beginning to see a pattern, sir." "As am I, Sergeant," Keyes replied. "Prepare the third vehicle. We need to establish whether this is universal to all Panthers or specific to certain production batches." The third trial, conducted on the 9th of August, incorporated even more conservative operating parameters. The crew was instructed to operate at walking pace, approximately 8 kilometers per hour, with frequent stops to allow cooling. Surely, Keyes reasoned, such gentle operation would prevent catastrophic overheating. For 2 hours, this approach appeared successful. The Panther circled the testing grounds at a leisurely pace, engine temperatures remaining moderate. But thermal damage, once initiated, creates cascading failure modes that conservative operation cannot always prevent. A fuel line, weakened by previous thermal cycling and now flexing repeatedly during prolonged operation, developed a hairline crack. Pressurized fuel misted onto the hot exhaust manifold. The resulting fire was almost immediate. The 11th of August 1944 found Major Keyes sitting in his cramped office at Bovington, surrounded by technical reports, photographs of charred components, and increasingly urgent memoranda from the War Office demanding conclusions. 3 captured Panthers had been reduced to scorched metal sculptures through testing. 2 remained, and pressure was mounting to either validate the reliability concerns or declare them anomalous. Keyes knew, with the certainty of an engineer who had spent weeks intimate with every mechanical detail, that the pattern was neither random nor correctable through operational procedures. Captain Whitmore entered carrying additional documentation, a thick folder of papers that had arrived via courier from London. "Intelligence intercepts, sir," he announced. "Decrypted German maintenance reports from Panzer divisions operating in Normandy. You'll want to read these." The documents, part of the Ultra-Intelligence Program's ongoing decryption of German military communications, provided a window into the desperate reality of Panther operations from the German perspective. One report from the 2nd Panzer Division, dated the 18th of July, documented that of 43 Panthers in the unit, only 11 were operational due to mechanical failures. The report's author, identified as Hauptmann Wilhelm Becker, had written with barely concealed frustration. "Engine fires continue to plague our battalion. We have lost 7 Panthers to spontaneous combustion in the past fortnight, without a single enemy shot being fired at them." Another intercepted message, this one from a logistics officer pleading for additional replacement parts, stated, "Forward units report catastrophic failure rates of final drives and transmissions. Estimated operational life of final drive units has proven to be approximately 100 kilometers, far below design specifications. Request immediate shipment of replacement assemblies and authorization for field modifications to cooling systems. They're struggling with the same issues we're observing," Whitmore noted unnecessarily. "This isn't a matter of poor maintenance or unfavorable conditions. The design is fundamentally flawed." Lieutenant Harrison had been conducting a parallel investigation into material science aspects of the failures. His analysis, completed on the 14th of August and presented to the assembled team that afternoon, revealed another dimension of the Panther's problems. "I've analyzed the composition of fuel lines, gaskets, and seals recovered from all 3 burned vehicles," Harrison explained, displaying samples of deteriorated materials under magnification. "These are ersatz materials, synthetic substitutes necessitated by Germany's resource shortages. Natural rubber compounds would tolerate the thermal environment somewhat better, though still inadequately. These synthetic variants degrade catastrophically at temperatures exceeding 80 degrees Celsius." Keyes examined the brittle, cracked samples. Germany's strategic situation had forced compromises throughout their industrial production. Allied control of maritime routes had choked off access to natural rubber from Southeast Asia. The synthetic alternatives, produced through complex chemical processes in German industrial facilities, represented impressive chemistry but inferior mechanical properties. In the unforgiving thermal environment of the Panther's engine compartment, these materials were quite literally disintegrating. "Gentlemen," Keyes addressed his team, "we need to determine if there are any operational conditions under which a Panther can function reliably. Prepare the 4th vehicle for testing under the most conservative parameters possible. Short duration runs, extensive cooling periods, and constant monitoring." The 4th trial, conducted on the 17th of August, employed a protocol so cautious it bordered on absurd. The Panther would operate for exactly 15 minutes, then shut down for 30 minutes of cooling, repeating this cycle throughout the day. Temperature monitoring equipment had been enhanced with additional sensors positioned at critical points throughout the engine compartment. A full medical team stood by, and fire crews were positioned at multiple points around the circuit. For 6 complete cycles, 90 minutes of total operation spread across 3 hours, the approach appeared successful. Engine temperatures peaked, but never exceeded 85 degrees Celsius. The crew reported normal operation, and external observers noted no signs of distress. Perhaps Keyes allowed himself to hope there was a narrow operational envelope within which Panthers could function safely. The fire began during the 7th cycle, approximately 8 minutes into the 15-minute run. Later analysis would reveal that an oil seal in the transmission had been gradually degrading throughout the previous cycles. The intermittent operation, heating and cooling repeatedly, had actually accelerated the material failure through thermal cycling fatigue. When the seal finally ruptured completely, it released a spray of transmission fluid onto components that had been heat-soaked through multiple cycles. "Evacuate immediately," Keyes shouted into the radio, but the experienced crew was already moving. They had drilled for this moment repeatedly, and their evacuation was textbook perfect. The fire, however, developed with shocking rapidity, suggesting that even conservative operation could not prevent the accumulation of conditions favorable to combustion. 4 Panthers, 4 engine fires. The pattern was now undeniable. On the 23rd of August, 1944, with 4 charred Panther hulks serving as monuments to German engineering's fatal compromises, Major Keyes prepared the 5th and final captured tank for what he grimly termed the conclusive trial. The pressure from the War Office had intensified, with senior officers demanding definitive conclusions that could inform tactical doctrine and strategic planning. If British forces encountered Panthers on the battlefield, commanders needed to know whether engaging them in extended operations would cause the German tanks to literally self-destruct. This final Panther appeared to be in exceptional condition, captured intact near Falaise when its crew abandoned it following a track thrown during maneuvers. Unlike the previous vehicles, this one showed no evidence of prior fire damage or field repairs. If any Panther could survive sustained testing, Keyes reasoned, it would be this one. Captain Whitmore had implemented additional modifications for this trial based on lessons learned from previous failures. The British team had replaced the most vulnerable fuel lines with higher-grade materials, improved sealing around the engine compartment, and even implemented enhanced cooling by partially opening the engine deck, a modification that would be suicidal in combat but might prove instructive in testing. "We're giving it every possible advantage," Whitmore explained. "If it still fails under these favorable conditions, we'll have irrefutable evidence that the design is irredeemable." Lieutenant Ashford, who had commanded crews in all previous trials, and evacuated from multiple burning Panthers, volunteered again for the final test. "I'm developing quite the expertise in emergency Panther evacuation procedures," he remarked with dark humor as he climbed into the commander's position. "Perhaps the War Office will add it to my service record." The trial commenced at 10 o'clock in the morning under overcast skies, ideal conditions for cooling, with ambient temperatures barely reaching 18 degrees Celsius. The testing protocol specified continuous operation at moderate speed, simulating a tactical march to a combat position. This represented realistic operational conditions that any tank would be expected to handle routinely. For the first hour, the modified Panther performed admirably. Engine temperatures remained stable, transmission behavior was smooth, and the enhanced cooling modifications appeared effective. Radio communications from the crew were routine, almost boring, exactly what everyone hoped for. Keyes began drafting mental revisions to his report, wondering if perhaps the previous failures had been due to accumulated damage from prior German operations, rather than inherent design flaws. At 73 minutes into the trial, Corporal Hayes reported the first anomaly. "Command, I'm detecting an unusual smell. Hot metal, possibly oil. Temperature's still reading normal, but the odor is concerning." "Noted. Continue monitoring closely," Keyes responded, tension returning to his shoulders. 7 minutes later, the smell intensified, and Hayes reported visible haze inside the crew compartment. "It's not smoke, sir. More like vapor or steam. But it's getting thicker." Keyes exchanged glances with Whitmore. They had seen this progression before, the prelude to catastrophic failure. "Prepare for immediate shutdown and evacuation on my command," Keyes transmitted. Before Ashford could acknowledge, the situation escalated with terrible familiarity. "Smoke. Definite smoke in the engine compartment." Hayes's voice carried controlled urgency. "Engine temperature just spiked to 103 degrees. "Evacuate now," Keyes ordered. The crew abandoned the Panther with practiced efficiency, and fire crews moved in immediately. But despite their rapid response and the enhanced cooling modifications, flames erupted from the engine compartment within minutes. The fire burned with particular intensity, fueled by leaked fluids that had accumulated despite the enhanced seals. By the time the fire was suppressed, the 5th Panther's engine compartment was thoroughly destroyed. 5 captured Panthers. 5 catastrophic engine fires. The conclusion was inescapable. On the 2nd of September, 1944, Major Edmund Keyes sat at his desk in the pre-dawn darkness, composing what would become one of the most consequential technical intelligence reports of the war. The weight of 5 destroyed Panthers, countless hours of meticulous engineering analysis, and the implications for Allied tactical doctrine rested in the document taking shape beneath his pen. Outside, Bovington remained quiet, but across the Channel in France, British armored divisions were engaging German forces daily, and the intelligence Keyes was about to deliver would inform how those engagements were prosecuted. The report, officially titled Technical Evaluation of German Panzerkampfwagen FIS, Panther, Operational Reliability Assessment, would eventually span 87 pages, complete with detailed technical drawings, photographic evidence, material analysis reports, and thermal modeling calculations. Keyes wrote the executive summary with deliberate precision. All 5 captured Panther tanks submitted to operational testing have experienced catastrophic engine compartment fires, resulting in complete vehicle loss. Failures occurred across varying operational profiles, ranging from aggressive sustained operation to extremely conservative intermittent use. Root cause analysis identifies fundamental design deficiencies in thermal management compounded by material quality compromises necessitated by German strategic resource shortages. The Panther, despite impressive combat capabilities, possesses inherent reliability vulnerabilities that severely limit operational effectiveness. Captain Whitmore entered the office at 6 o'clock, carrying steaming cups of tea in his own section of the report, a comprehensive mechanical analysis of transmission and final drive failures. "I've documented 23 distinct failure modes we observed across the 5 vehicles," he reported, settling into a chair. "The most damning finding is that the final drives are fundamentally under-engineered for the vehicle's weight and power. Even if we solved the fire problem, these tanks would still experience catastrophic drivetrain failures at an alarming rate. The historical significance of their findings extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. According to post-war analyses published in military history journals, including a comprehensive study in the Journal of Strategic Studies examining Panther production and deployment, German industry manufactured approximately 6,000 Panthers between January 1943 and April 1945. Of these, losses to mechanical failure exceeded losses to enemy action throughout much of the vehicle's service life. The Bovington trials had revealed in microcosm what German armored forces were experiencing across all theaters of operation. Lieutenant Harrison contributed the thermal analysis section, complete with mathematical models demonstrating why the Panther's cooling system was inadequate. The fundamental problem is that German designers prioritized combat performance, armor protection, firepower, mobility, above reliability, Harrison explained. Every design decision was optimized for battlefield effectiveness, assuming that logistics and maintenance could compensate for mechanical fragility. They miscalculated how impossible that would prove under actual operational conditions. By the 8th of September, the complete report was ready for distribution. Keyes personally delivered copies to the War Office, where senior officers including Major General Noel Irwin, responsible for armored doctrine development, reviewed the findings with intense interest. The implications were immediately clear. British armored forces could potentially exploit German Panthers' mechanical vulnerabilities through tactical approaches that maximized German operational tempo and minimized engagement time. If we can force Panther units into sustained operations, extended movements, repeated engagements, anything that prevents adequate cooling and maintenance, they will degrade themselves, Keyes explained during his presentation to senior commanders. Our Shermans and Cromwells may be outgunned in direct confrontation, but they can outlast Panthers through superior reliability. The report triggered significant changes in British tactical doctrine. Intelligence summaries distributed to field commanders emphasized the importance of maintaining operational pressure on German armored units, rather than seeking decisive tank versus tank battles that played to the Panther's combat strengths. British doctrine evolved toward mobility-focused operations that exploited the German tank's mechanical weaknesses. Interestingly, captured German documents examined after the war's conclusion revealed that Wehrmacht commanders were acutely aware of the Panther's reliability crisis. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, appointed Inspector General of Panzer Troops in February 1943, had repeatedly demanded modifications to address the overheating and transmission failures. However, Germany's deteriorating strategic situation and Hitler's insistence on maximizing production numbers over quality improvements meant that fundamental design flaws were never adequately resolved. In a perverse way, Keyes reflected to his team as they packed up their Bovington workshop in late September, the Germans' technological sophistication worked against them. They created an extraordinary combat vehicle, pound for pound, probably the best tank design of the war, but made it so complex and resource-intensive that it couldn't be reliably manufactured or maintained under wartime conditions. The impact of Major Keyes's report rippled through British military planning throughout the autumn of 1944. On the 15th of October, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group advancing through Northwest Europe, received a tactical intelligence briefing that incorporated the Bovington findings. The implications fundamentally altered how British armored commanders approached engagements with Panther-equipped German units. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Carver, commanding the 4th County of London Yeomanry equipped with Sherman Firefly tanks, exemplified the doctrinal evolution. During operations near Venray in mid-October, his unit encountered elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division fielding approximately 24 Panthers. Rather than attempting to close for direct engagement, where the Panther's superior gun and armor would prove decisive, Carver implemented a harassment strategy informed by the reliability intelligence. "We'll maintain contact but avoid decisive engagement," Carver briefed his squadron commanders. "Force them to maneuver repeatedly. Make them button up and operate their vehicles intensively. Intelligence suggests they'll break down on their own given sufficient operational pressure." Over 4 days of running engagements, British forces used superior tactical mobility and numerical advantage to keep German Panther units in constant motion. The results validated Keyes's findings dramatically. Of 23 Panthers initially present in the German unit, 7 were abandoned due to mechanical failures, broken transmissions, burned final drives and engine fires, without being engaged by British fire. The remaining Panthers, forced to operate at high tempo while conducting fighting withdrawals, showed severely degraded performance as mechanical issues accumulated. Captain David Thompson, commanding a Sherman troop during these operations, later wrote in his after-action report, "We observed multiple German Panthers simply stopping during maneuvers, their crews evacuating and setting demolition charges rather than attempting repairs. One Panther began smoking heavily during a tactical movement, and the crew abandoned it minutes before flames erupted from the engine compartment, exactly as described in intelligence briefings. The tactical intelligence reached American forces as well. General George Patton's Third Army, driving eastward through France and into Germany, incorporated the Panther reliability assessment into operational planning. American combat doctrine increasingly emphasized rapid, sustained advances that prevented German armored units from establishing defensive positions and conducting the careful maintenance that Panthers required for continued operation. According to information compiled in post-war operational analyses, particularly those published by the United States Army's Armor School at Fort Knox, German Panther units operating in Western Europe during the final year of the war experienced operational readiness rates rarely exceeding 40%. Mechanical breakdowns claimed more Panthers than Allied gunfire in most engagements, validating the findings from the Bovington trials. However, the intelligence community also tracked German attempts to address the reliability crisis. By late 1944, modified Panthers began appearing with improved engine cooling, additional radiators, modified airflow patterns, and reinforced components. These late production Panthers, manufactured with whatever quality materials Germany could still obtain, showed modest reliability improvements. Major Keys received several requests to evaluate these newer vehicles, but by that time, the war's trajectory had shifted decisively against Germany, and the Panthers' mechanical problems were becoming less strategically significant than the Wehrmacht's overall collapse. British tank crews, despite benefiting from the tactical intelligence, maintained grudging respect for the Panther as a combat vehicle. Sergeant Harold Bowers, a Sherman commander in the 11th Armored Division, captured this ambivalence in a letter home. "The Jerry Panther is a fearsome beast when it's running properly. Their gun can kill us from ranges where we can barely scratch their armor. But we're learning they're temperamental machines. Keep them moving, deny them time for maintenance, and they fall apart on their own. Our Shermans may be outgunned, but they keep running when the Panthers quit." The most significant long-term impact of the Bovington trials extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. The exhaustive documentation of the Panther's reliability failures informed post-war British tank design philosophy. Engineers working on the Centurion tank program, which would produce one of the most successful post-war tank designs, explicitly referenced lessons learned from captured German vehicles. The Centurion emphasized reliability and maintainability alongside combat performance, directly contradicting the German approach of prioritizing combat capability over operational sustainability. As 1945 unfolded and Allied armies drove into the heart of Germany, the strategic significance of individual tank designs diminished amid the Wehrmacht's comprehensive collapse. Yet the intelligence gathered at Bovington continued to inform tactical operations and, more importantly, shaped the post-war understanding of armored vehicle design philosophy. Major Edmund Keyes, promoted to lieutenant colonel in January 1945 for his contributions to technical intelligence, spent the war's final months analyzing a stream of captured German equipment, but the Panther trials remained his most consequential work. The 5 destroyed Panthers at Bovington became something more than burnt-out wrecks. They transformed into teaching tools that would educate generations of British armor officers. After the war's conclusion, the Tank Museum at Bovington preserved remnants from the trials, including several of the fire-damaged engine compartments, as permanent exhibits illustrating the consequences of inadequate engineering validation under wartime pressure. Museum documentation, compiled for public education purposes, emphasized a central lesson. Technological sophistication without reliability. Engineering creates weapons that impress on paper, but fail in practice. Post-war interrogations of German tank designers and production officials revealed the institutional pressures that had produced the Panther's fatal compromises. Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp, one of the chief engineers involved in Panther development, testified during technical debriefings conducted in May 1945 that his team had identified and documented the cooling and transmission problems during prototype testing in 1942. However, Hitler's personal intervention, demanding immediate production following Germany's shocking losses on the Eastern Front, had forced the Panther into service before solutions could be implemented. "We knew the final drives were inadequately designed for the vehicle's weight and power requirements," Kniepkamp stated in declassified interrogation transcripts. "We knew the cooling system was marginal. We knew the transmission was overly complex and difficult to manufacture to necessary tolerances. We documented all of these issues, but we were overruled by political leadership demanding immediate production numbers." This revelation reinforced what Major Keyes' team had concluded through their destructive testing. The Panther represented a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing sophisticated technology into production without adequate development time. German industry manufactured nearly 6,000 Panthers, but the actual combat effectiveness of this impressive fleet was severely compromised by mechanical unreliability that made each vehicle a temporary asset rather than a dependable weapon system. Captain Whitmore, who had worked alongside Keyes throughout the evaluation process, later authored a comprehensive paper titled Reliability Engineering in Armored Vehicle Design that became required reading at British military engineering schools. His central thesis: combat performance means nothing if the vehicle cannot reach the battlefield or sustain operations once engaged. The German Panther possessed arguably the finest combination of firepower, protection, and mobility of any tank produced during the Second World War. Yet it stands as a failure because it could not reliably perform its mission. The Americans reached similar conclusions through parallel testing programs. The United States Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland conducted its own evaluation of captured Panthers throughout 1944 and into early 1945. Their findings, published in Technical Bulletin TB Ord 460 dated March 1945, corroborated the British results almost exactly. American engineers documented catastrophic transmission failures, final drive breakdowns, and engine fires across multiple test vehicles. One particularly telling observation noted that the Panther's Maybach engine, while producing impressive power, consumed fuel at a rate nearly double that of comparable American engines, creating logistical burdens that further compromised operational sustainability. Soviet forces, who faced the majority of deployed Panthers on the Eastern Front, developed their own tactical responses to the German tanks' reliability problems. Red Army doctrine evolved to emphasize rapid exploitation operations that prevented German armored units from conducting the careful maintenance that Panthers required. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's planning for major offensives in 1944 and 45 explicitly incorporated intelligence about Panther mechanical vulnerability, with operational orders emphasizing sustained pressure to maximize German equipment breakdown rates. By the time Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945, the Panther had established a contradictory legacy. Military historians examining the war's tank development programs would identify the Panther as perhaps the most capable medium tank design of the conflict in terms of raw combat potential. Its 75mm gun could defeat any Allied tank at standard combat ranges. Its sloped armor provided excellent protection within reasonable weight parameters. Its mobility, when the drivetrain functioned properly, was impressive for a 45-ton vehicle. Yet that same historical analysis would conclude that the Panther was ultimately a failed weapon system precisely because reliability engineering had been sacrificed to achieve those impressive combat characteristics. A tank that spent more time under repair than in combat, that required replacement transmissions every few hundred kilometers, that could spontaneously combust during routine operations. Such a vehicle could not fulfill its strategic purpose, regardless of its theoretical capabilities. Major Keyes reflected on these lessons in a lecture delivered to Royal Armoured Corps officers at Bovington on the 15th of June, 1945, just weeks after Germany's surrender. Standing before an audience of veterans who had fought against Panthers in France, Belgium, and Germany, he used the 5 destroyed test vehicles as visual aids. "Gentlemen, these burned hulks represent a fundamental truth about military technology," Keyes began, gesturing toward the scorched Panther remains displayed in the workshop. "Sophistication without reliability is worse than useless, It's actively harmful. It diverts resources, creates false confidence, and ultimately fails when most needed. He continued. The Germans designed a magnificent tank, but they designed it for a war that existed only in their imaginations, a war where industrial capacity was unlimited, where skilled technicians were abundant, where operational tempo allowed for extensive maintenance, where replacement parts arrived on schedule. They designed the Panther for a Wehrmacht that had already ceased to exist by the time their tank entered production. We must learn from their failure. That lesson would profoundly influence British tank development for decades. The Centurion, entering service in 1945, embodied design principles that explicitly rejected the German approach. British engineers prioritized mechanical reliability, ease of maintenance, and component accessibility. The Centurion's Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, derived from the Merlin aircraft engine, was deliberately derated from its maximum potential power output to enhance reliability and component longevity. Transmission and final drive units were designed with comfortable safety margins rather than being optimized to theoretical limits. The result was a tank that served effectively in British and Allied forces for over 40 years, seeing combat in Korea, the Middle East, India, and Africa, a service life that would have been impossible for a vehicle designed to Panther standards. The 5 destroyed Panthers at Bovington had taught their final lesson, one that would echo through military engineering philosophy for generations. That true excellence in weapons design requires balancing multiple competing demands, that combat performance must be tempered by reliability engineering, and that the most sophisticated technology is worthless if it cannot function under the brutal conditions of actual warfare. Lieutenant Harrison, the thermodynamics specialist who had first identified the Panther's cooling deficiencies, later joined the Royal Military College of Science, where he taught mechanical engineering to future generations of British military technical officers. He would regularly recount the Panther trials to his students, emphasizing a simple maxim: the enemy gets a vote in how your weapon system will be employed. If you design for ideal conditions, you guarantee failure under real conditions. As the sun set over Bovington on that June evening in 1945, Major Keyes stood alone among the charred Panther hulks, contemplating the strange trajectory that had brought these German machines to an English testing ground where they would destroy themselves through their own design flaws. The war was ending, the documentation was complete, and the lessons had been learned, but at a cost measured in 5 irreplaceable examples of sophisticated engineering consumed by fires that need never have occurred. The historical record preserved in military archives, museum collections, and declassified intelligence documents would ensure that the story of the Bovington Panther trials remained available to future generations. These 5 tanks, destroyed not by enemy action but by their own inherent vulnerabilities, stood as monuments to the dangers of prioritizing sophistication over sustainability, combat performance over operational reliability, and theoretical excellence over practical effectiveness. In the final analysis, perhaps the greatest irony was that German engineers had created what might have been the war's finest tank design. If only they had possessed the time, resources, and institutional patience to solve the problems they themselves had identified. Instead, they fielded a flawed masterpiece that impressed observers, terrified opponents, and ultimately failed its crews when reliability mattered most. The 5 Panthers tested to destruction at Bovington had revealed that truth with brutal clarity, providing intelligence that shaped not just the war's final year, but the entire post-war evolution of armored warfare doctrine and design philosophy. The trials were complete. The fires had burned out. The lessons endured.